Imagine a room in the heart of Manhattan, 1869. The air is thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive brandy. Two men sit across from each other, whispering a plan that would, within 48 hours, bankrupt thousands of families, cause a string of suicides, and bring the President of the United States to his knees. This isn't a movie. This is the day Wall Street bled gold. Fort 1. The Puppeteers of Wall Street. The year was 1869. The American Civil War had been only 4 years, and the nation was a wounded giant trying to stand. The South was in ruins, the North was booming with industrial fever, and in Washington, D.C., Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the Union, had just taken his seat in the Oval Office. But the real power didn't reside in the White House. It lived in the shadows of Lower Manhattan, in the minds of two of the most cunning robber barons history has ever known, Jay Gould and James Fisk. Jay Gould was a small, frail man with dark, piercing eyes and a beard that hid a permanent, calculating scowl. He was often called the Mephistopheles of Wall Street. He didn't care for luxury. He cared for the mathematical thrill of the kill. His partner, Jubilee Jim Fisk, was the opposite, loud, flamboyant, wearing diamond-studded waistcoats and obsessed with the spotlight. Together, they were the most dangerous duo in America. The hidden variable, gold. At this time, the U.S. government issued greenbacks, paper money, but the value of everything was tied to gold. The government held a massive supply of gold in the treasury. If the government sold gold, the price stayed low. If they stopped selling, the price would skyrocket. Gould had a realization that chilled him with excitement. If I can convince the president to stop selling gold, I can corner the market. I can own every ounce of gold in New York. I can hold the entire nation's economy hostage. The infiltration. But how do you manipulate a president? You don't walk into the White House and ask. You find a backdoor. Gould found his backdoor in a man named Abel Corbin. Corbin was an old, ambitious speculator who had one very important asset. He was married to President Grant's sister, Virginia. Gould and Fisk began a charm offensive. They invited Corbin and the president on their lavish private steamboats. They gave them the finest wines and sat them in the Gold Room. While Fisk distracted the president with jokes and war stories, Gould whispered into Corbin's ear. He convinced Corbin that if the price of gold rose, the American farmer would benefit. A lie. Corbin, blinded by the promise of millions, began to whisper into the president's ear. For weeks, the President of the United States was being played like a violin by a man who never left the shadows. The trap is set. By September 1869, Gould and Fisk had secretly started buying. They bought gold through dozens of different brokers, so no one would know it was them. They bought millions, then tens of millions. As they bought, the price of gold began to creep up. On the floor of the New York Gold Room, brokers began to panic. "Who is buying?" they shouted. "Why is the price rising?" Gould sat in his office, his fingers drumming on a mahogany desk. He had convinced the president's brother-in-law to write a letter to Grant, urging him not to sell any government gold. He had even bribed the Assistant Treasurer of the United States, Daniel Butterfield, with a $1.5 million stake in the scheme. The trap was set. The American economy was a powder keg, and Jay Gould was holding the match. He wasn't just looking for profit. He was looking to become the secret king of the United States. But Gould knew something Fisk didn't. He knew that when a bubble pops, everyone dies, unless you're the one who pops it. Even as he told Fisk to keep buying, Gould began to secretly sell. He was preparing to betray his own best friend.
Part 2. The Eve of Destruction and the President's Awakening. The atmosphere in New York City on the night of September 23, 1869, was thick, not just with the humid autumn air, but with a palpable electric tension. In the wood-paneled dens of the Union Square clubs and the gritty taverns of Wall Street, the word gold was the only thing on anyone's lips. Jay Gould sat in his private office at the Erie Railroad headquarters, the building itself a fortress of dark stone. He was a man who thrived in silence. While the rest of the city slept, or tried to, Gould was reading the ticker tape, the long, thin strips of paper that brought the news of the world's markets. The price of gold had closed at 143. It was rising. His plan was working. But Gould was a shark who could smell blood in the water, even if it was his own. He had received a secret message from Abel Corbin, the president's brother-in-law. The message was panicked. It suggested that President Grant was beginning to grow suspicious. The betrayal in the dark. In that moment, Jay Gould did something that defines the cold-blooded nature of the robber barons. He didn't call his partner Jim Fisk. He didn't warn the man who had stood by him in every legal and illegal battle. Instead, Gould began to issue secret orders to his most trusted brokers. "Sell," he whispered. "Sell everything, but do it slowly. Do it through a dozen different names. Do not let Fisk know." Gould was shorting the very market he was supposedly cornering. He was setting up Fisk to be the bagman, the one left holding the debt when the crash finally came. To the public, Gould was still the great bull driving prices up. In reality, he was a ghost slipping out the back door while the house was still on fire. Washington, D.C., the general's fury. Meanwhile, at a secluded vacation spot in Pennsylvania, President Ulysses S. Grant was playing a game of cards. He was a man of simple tastes and a rigid sense of honor, traits that made him a legendary general but a vulnerable president. A messenger arrived with a letter from his wife, Julia. She had been contacted by her sister-in-law, Mrs. Corbin. The letter was a clumsy attempt to influence the president's financial policy. Grant put the cards down. His eyes, usually calm, turned to the cold steel blue that his soldiers saw at the Battle of Shiloh. He realized then that he had been used. His own family had been turned into pawns by the wolves of Wall Street. Grant didn't panic. He didn't call the press conference. He sat down and wrote a single short letter to his Secretary of the Treasury, George Boutwell. "The bubble must burst," the president implied. He ordered Boutwell to prepare to sell $5 million worth of government gold the moment the market opened. The trap Gould had set for America was now being countered by a trap set by the president for Gould. September 24, Black Friday begins. The morning of Friday, September 24, broke with a strange, sickly yellow sun over Manhattan. By 9 a.m., the New York Gold Room on Broad Street was packed. This wasn't just a room of businessmen, it was a mosh pit of desperation. Jim Fisk arrived in a carriage drawn by 4 white horses, wearing a lavender suit and a diamond as large as a walnut. He strutted into the gold room like a king. "I'll bet any man here that gold goes to 200, Fisk shouted, his voice booming over the frantic chatter. The price climbed. 150, 155, 160. The room was a riot. Men were screaming, their collars torn, their faces purple with exertion. Outside, thousands of people, clerks, janitors, even street sweepers, gathered to hear the price. Their life savings were tied to the value of the dollar, and the dollar was dying. Fisk was buying everything. He thought he was winning. He looked around for Gould, but Gould was nowhere to be seen. Gould was hidden in a small room nearby, listening to the telegraph. He heard the price hit 162. He knew the ceiling had been reached. Then, at exactly 11:45 a.m., the telegraph operator's hand began to shake. A message was coming through from Washington. The flash of gold. The Secretary of the Treasury had spoken. The United States government was dumping $4 million of pure gold onto the market immediately. The effect was like an explosion. In an instant, the price of gold plummeted. It didn't go down, it vanished. Within 15 minutes, it crashed from 162 back down to 133. The gold room became a scene of pure horror. Men who were millionaires at 11:40 a.m. were beggars by noon. One broker, a man named Albert Spayers, who had been buying for Fisk, lost his mind. He stood in the center of the room, still shouting, "I'll buy at 160, even as the price hit 135. He had bought $60 million worth of gold that he could never pay for. Jim Fisk froze. He realized in that heartbeat that he was ruined. He looked at the telegraph as it spilled onto the floor like a dead snake. "The bubble has burst," someone screamed. The crowd turned into a lynch mob. They began looking for Fisk and Gould. "Hang them," they cried. "Find the robber barons."
Part 3. The Fortress of the Erie and the Long Shadow of Ruin. The scene outside the New York Gold Room was no longer a financial exchange. It was a war zone. The air was filled with the sound of breaking glass and the guttural roars of men who had seen their entire lives, their homes, their businesses, their children's futures,
evaporate in less than 15 minutes. "Where is Fisk? Where is that devil Gould?" The mob was swelling. Thousands of angry New Yorkers, some armed with clubs and others with improvised nooses, began to surge toward the brokerage houses. They wanted blood to pay for the gold they had lost. The Great Escape. Inside the chaos, Jim Fisk, the man who had been laughing and betting just an hour before, was white as a sheet. He finally understood the gravity of the betrayal. He found Jay Gould huddled in a back room, his face impassive, his eyes fixed on a small scrap of paper. "Jay, they're going to kill us," Fisk bellowed, his flamboyant lavender suit now stained with sweat. Gould didn't look up. "We must reach the Opera House," he said calmly. The Opera House was the Grand Opera House on 23rd Street, which also served as the headquarters for their Erie Railroad. It was a literal fortress, equipped with thick walls and private armed guards. But getting there meant crossing a city that wanted them dead. In a move that sounds like a Hollywood thriller, the two most hated men in America slipped out a back door into a narrow, filthy alleyway. They didn't take Fisk's carriage with the white horses. That would have been a death sentence. Instead, they scrambled into a common, unmarked hackney cab, pulling the curtains tight. As they drove through the streets, they could hear the rioters. At one point, a group of men recognized Fisk through a gap in the curtain. They began to chase the carriage, screaming obscenities. The driver lashed the horses, narrowly escaping the mob as they reached the iron gates of the Grand Opera House. The heavy doors slammed shut and the bolts were thrown. They were safe, but the country outside was screaming. The aftermath, a nation in mourning. While Gould and Fisk sat behind their armed guards, the rest of the United States woke up to a financial wasteland. In the 19th century, there was no FDIC to protect bank accounts. There was no Social Security. If your bank failed, your money was gone forever. On that Friday afternoon, dozens of major brokerage firms collapsed. Banks shut their doors. The contagion spread from Wall Street to the heartland. In the Midwest, farmers who had borrowed money against the high price of gold suddenly found their debts doubled and their crops worthless. In the small towns of Pennsylvania and Ohio, local banks disappeared overnight. It wasn't just a bad day on the market, it was a national trauma. The newspapers the next morning carried a headline that would stick in the American psyche for a century: Black Friday. The legal magic show. You might think that after nearly destroying the American economy, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk would spend the rest of their lives in a cold prison cell. But this was the Gilded Age, an era where the law was often something you could buy, wrap in silk, and put in your pocket. Gould and Fisk were masters of the Tammany Hall political machine. They had a pocket full of judges, most notably Judge Albert Cardozo. As hundreds of lawsuits were filed against them, Judge Cardozo issued a series of injunctions. He effectively blocked any legal action against the duo. He ruled that their contracts were void or untraceable. Gould's genius was his complexity. He had used so many fake names and shell companies that the prosecutors couldn't prove which gold belonged to him and which gold belonged to the victims. He sat in his fortress, sipping tea, while his lawyers turned the American justice system into a circus. The broken president. The biggest casualty, however, wasn't financial. It was the reputation of the president. Ulysses S. Grant was a man of iron during the war, but the Black Friday scandal stained his presidency forever. Even though he had eventually done the right thing by releasing the gold, the fact that his brother-in-law, Abel Carbon, was a lead conspirator made the public believe the president was in on it. The American people's trust in their government was shattered. They saw that a couple of wealthy men in a private room could override the power of the White House. The American dream began to look like a rigged game.
Part 4. The Love Triangle and the Pistol on the Stairs. While Jay Gould was a ghost who lived for ledgers and numbers, Jim Fisk lived for the flash of the limelight and the thrill of the chase. But in the wake of Black Friday, the king of Wall Street found that all the gold in the world couldn't protect his heart or his life. The downfall of Jim Fisk didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened because of a woman named Josie Mansfield. The Siren of 23rd Street. Josie was a stunning, ambitious actress whom Fisk had set up in a lavish brownstone just a few doors down from his Grand Opera House. He showered her with diamonds, carriages, and thousands of dollars a month. To Fisk, she was his princess. To the rest of New York, she was the most dangerous woman in the city. The problem was a man named Edward S. Stokes. Stokes was a handsome, high-society businessman who had once been Fisk's friend and business partner. But Stokes wanted two things that belonged to Fisk: his oil refinery business and his mistress. Soon, a scandalous love triangle began to rot the foundations of Fisk's empire. Josie and Stokes began an affair behind Fisk's back, using Fisk's own money to fund their secret life. When Fisk finally discovered the betrayal, he didn't just break up with Josie.
he declared a legal war that would captivate every newspaper reader in the United States. Blackmail and the stolen letters. By 1871, the battle had turned toxic. Stokes and Josie attempted to blackmail Fisk, threatening to publish private letters that allegedly detailed his corrupt business dealings and his roles in the Black Friday scandal. Fisk, never one to back down, sued them for extortion. The court cases became a media circus. The Gilded Age public, who loved a good scandal as much as they loved a gold rush, watched as the Prince of Erie was dragged through the mud. On the morning of January 6, 1872, a judge ruled against Edward Stokes in a critical legal motion. Stokes was ruined, his reputation in tatters, and his financial future gone. He blamed one man, James Fisk. The Grand Central Hotel tragedy. Later that afternoon, Jim Fisk arrived at the Grand Central Hotel on Broadway. He was there to visit another mistress, looking to escape the stress of the courtroom. As he stepped out of his carriage and walked through the elegant doors, he began to climb the grand red-carpeted staircase. He didn't see Edward Stokes waiting at the top of the stairs. Stokes pulled a Colt revolver from his coat. The first shot rang out, hitting Fisk in the abdomen. Fisk stumbled, crying out, "Oh, look out!" as a second shot tore into his arm. The Jubilee Jim of New York fell, rolling down the stairs he had so often climbed with pride. The man who had survived the greatest financial lynch mob in history had been taken down by a jilted lover with a $10 pistol. The death of a giant. Fisk didn't die instantly. He was carried to a suite in the hotel where doctors worked frantically to save him. In a scene that defined the era, Jay Gould rushed to his partner's bedside. For the first and perhaps only time in his life, the cold, calculating Jay Gould showed emotion. He sat by Fisk, holding his hand, as the life drained out of the man who had been his only true friend in the shark-infested waters of Wall Street. At 10:45 the next morning, Jim Fisk breathed his last. His funeral was the largest New York had ever seen. 200 carriages followed his casket. The city that had tried to hang him 2 years earlier now wept for him. He was the ultimate American paradox: a crook, a hero, a clown, and a king.
Part 5. The Gilded Wolf's Final Legacy. With Fisk dead, the eerie ring was broken, but Jay Gould was far from finished. If the 1860s were about gold, the 1870s and 80s were about steel and information. The master of the world. Gould took the lessons of Black Friday and applied them to the two most important technologies of the age, the railroads and the telegraph. He realized that whoever controlled the flow of information controlled the world. He launched a brutal, silent war to take over Western Union, the telegraph giant. He would buy small telegraph companies, drive Western Union's stock price down with rumors, and then swoop in to buy the weakened giant. By 1881, he owned it. He did the same with the railroads. At the height of his power, Jay Gould controlled 1/9 of all the railroad mileage in the United States. If you traveled west, you likely rode on his tracks. If you sent a message to a loved one, you used his wires. The ghost departs. Jay Gould died in 1892 of tuberculosis. He was only 56 years old. He left behind a fortune of over $77 million, equivalent to billions today, but he died as the most hated man in America. He didn't give his money to libraries like Andrew Carnegie. He didn't build universities like Vanderbilt. He left every penny to his family. Why we remember. The story of the gold conspiracy and the robber barons isn't just a tale of old men in top hats. It is the story of how modern America was built. It taught the U.S. government that it needed to regulate Wall Street, leading eventually to the creation of the SEC. It showed that the American dream could be hijacked by those with enough shadow power. And it serves as a permanent warning that in the pursuit of gold, the first thing people often lose is their soul. Today, when you see a stock market crash or a billionaire scandal on the news, remember the ghosts of 1869. Remember the frail man in the dark office and the flamboyant man on the stairs. They were the ones who taught Wall Street how to bleed and how to win at any cost.